My name is Richard Kasama. I was born in Los Angeles, California. I'm the first of three. My parents also were from Los Angeles. And initially, when we first got to this, when I was first born, my father had just come back to the United States after being in Japan after World War II, along with my mom. And they started all over again, from scratch. My grandfather, on my father's side, was a farmer, and we owned a farm where Knott's Berry Farm amusement park now stands. We used to grow strawberries for the Knottses. So periodically I'd spend time on the farm, and it would be with my parents and my grandparents. I got to know my grandparents as well. But shortly thereafter we moved. We were in Utah for a couple of years where my sister was born. My father had to go back to college. And then after he finished college in Utah, he came back to San Francisco where he did law school. He went to Lincoln Law School. And that was a tough time for us because at that point we had very little money. Most of it had been spent in the early years. And it was even made more difficult by the fact that my father, your grandfather, was diagnosed with tuberculosis. And he ended up in what was then pleasantly called a sanatorium, which was really a prison for people with active TB. Fortunately, that was also the time at which they started coming out with drugs to treat tuberculosis. So he was one of the first people to be put on a combination of INH and streptomycin, brand new drugs. And he supposedly got cured, he got out, and our family was reunified. But during that time, I had to spend about a year with my aunt in San Diego, who was quite a disciplinarian. I remember that distinctly. She had lived in I don't know if it was an apartment or a house, but it had all white walls, and I wasn't allowed to touch anything. So I spent a year sort of in my own little room, mainly on the floor, playing with my trains, and then going to school or whatever. But when the family got together, Dad finally finished up law school. After trying to take the bar twice. He tried to take it after he got out of the hospital, but he wasn't prepared for that. Went back to school for a year and then passed the bar. And then we moved to Fremont, which is where, for the most part, I grew up. So that's also where my youngest brother was born, and we lived there for a good 10, 15 years before I went off to college. It was quite a nice time, different place. Classic suburbia, American. Primarily an all-white community, but we had what was called the Japanese American Citizen League. We'd have all these gatherings. We'd split our time between, we're Baptists, so we would go to the Baptist church, but on Saturdays and some Sundays we'd go to the Buddhist church and help out. We would do the fundraisers and all that stuff, mainly for the Buddhist church because it was the Japanese American community. And I remember that with fond memories. Especially I loved doing bingo. 54, 54, B7, B7. It was good times. On my father's side of the family, my grandparents had already moved back to Japan. Grandpa was, I don't know what you call him, a gentleman farmer. He farmed. He made a ton of money farming. And then as the war broke out, the entire family moved back to Japan because things were getting really quite dicey, especially in California, and not just against Japanese, but any Asians whatsoever. So he hired people to take care of the farm while the family was in Japan. My grandparents on my mother's side of the family is a different story. That's a part of the story that's all sort of clouded, and I'm not quite sure what the truth is about my grandparents' side of the family on my mother's side. The story that I've heard is that my grandfather, my mother's father, was a really bad businessman. Kept getting himself into trouble, but he had some political connections, and he'd squandered all his money in the United States, and my grandmother had to work as a geisha in LA to make enough money. And apparently at some point just before the war they moved. There was an odd move back to Japan where your grandmother, my mother, sister and brother ended up in, of all places, Singapore. And that's when your great-grandfather, my grandfather, there's something about him abandoning them there, and crazy stories about them having to get back into Japan, and my mother, who could speak English and Japanese, was not actually that good at her Japanese at that point. They struggled during the war to get through the war. They bounced from relative to relative to relative. But after the war ended, because she could speak English and she could type and do shorthand, that's what women did in those days. They went to school, they didn't learn how to become CEOs, they learned to cook and become secretaries. She became one of the Secretary of War for Douglas MacArthur, which was fortuitous because Douglas MacArthur told my mom, your grandmother, that if she came back to the United States, if she needed a job, she was guaranteed to have a job anywhere there was a military base. And for that he was good to his word, because when we came back, in LA she worked in an army base. In Utah, out in the middle of nowhere, she worked on a missile base, which, high security, and she's Japanese American, amazing to have her get a job there. And then when we moved to San Francisco, she had a job at the Presidio. So wherever we went, Fremont, she had a job at some other military base. It was just amazing. And for that reason, my mom was a devout Republican because Doug MacArthur was a Republican. So whenever she voted, it didn't matter who was up for election. She just went down the Republican column and clicked all the names because that was her way of paying back, Doug MacArthur. So that was it. Dad's side of the family, when the war ended, Grandpa came back and farmed. That's how I remember the strawberry farm. But when I was about, 3 or 4 years old, he had a massive stroke. And they sold the farm and they moved back to Japan. And I saw him in a place called Setagaya. And I would see him there periodically when I went to Japan. Never recovered from the stroke. And as I said, the farm is now part of Knott's Berry Farm Amusement Park. So your grandfather, my father, the Kasama family during World War II, as it started to break out, they were actually dual citizens. They were citizens of the U.S. and the United States. And they would have been considered enemy aliens. But my father's side of the family was very politically connected. And as a result, they protected my father so well and hid his American identity that he got drafted. And he initially got drafted in the Army, and he was rejected from the Army because of his bad eyesight. We Kasamas have bad eyesight. So he was real happy. He went home, he said, I don't have to go. Next thing you know, he got a draft notice from the Navy, and they didn't care about eyesight. What was ironic about that is not only did he get drafted in the Navy, he got drafted into the Air Corps of the Navy to mine planes, even though he had bad eyesight. So they didn't care as long as he wore glasses and he could fly. I understand the story behind that, why they tried so hard to get him in the military, was a lot of the Kasama connections were in the Secret Service, or the, I don't know what you want to call it, the intelligence service of Japan. And they wanted him in there for a couple reasons. One, they could protect him, and the second thing is he could speak English, so he would be perfect. But when he got drafted in the Navy, they put him in the Air Corps, and what happened is in the Japanese Navy, because it's mobile, it moves constantly, and they were never able to catch up with him. And he described in his training, one day he went on his first aircraft carrier, and he wanted to see how high the conning tower was. So there was these, steps going up to the top, and he was counting the steps as he was going up to the top. And we got to the very top. There was an officer there waiting for him. Well, he's just standing guard, right? And my father got up there. Of course, he was unauthorized to be in the conning tower, and the officer said, "There's only one way down from here. Open the door. It's a door to the outside, and it's a good several hundred feet drop to the water." And so, sure enough, Dad had to take that leap out the door, and then swim back to the shore, and that was a lesson, that you didn't mess around where you weren't supposed to be. So he flew fighters and torpedo planes and just about anything the Japanese flew, except for bombers during World War II. Managed to survive, which was amazing. And eventually, in fact, he was one of only 2 survivors from this